Okay, let's move to that last question. Who do you think I should ask next? And some of the yeah, because I know that you have a list of a few people that you wanted to talk about. So let's hear it.
Hmm. Um, my co-founder in humanizing work, Peter Green, is
I
really
think that's
interesting.
him.
That's Peter. Yep, musician turned agilist, was the leader of the agile transformation at Adobe for a long
Adobe.
time
Wow.
before he joined me. So he's got some really interesting experiences and would be great to talk with.
Hi. Today I'm talking with Peter Green. We talked about how luck played a part in moving from musician to IT. How Agile helped his team to deliver better quality on time without doing crazy hours, and then letting Agile grow organically in the rest of his company. I'm Yves Hanul from Who's Agile. My pronouns are he and him. Welcome to my channel. You see a lot of Agilists around me on this screen. If you want to hear me interviewing, please click that subscribe button because these are the people that I've invited so far. If you think I'm missing people, let me know in the comments. And that like button, well, if you liked today's interview, don't forget to click it. Hello everyone, and hello Peter. Welcome.
Thanks, Eve. Very happy to be here.
Well, and here, let's show that immediately. Should be, oops, it doesn't. Yeah, so this is showing here for me is Belgium, and I'm where that little blue dot is. And then we're moving to Phoenix in the US, if I'm not mistaken. This is where Peter is, and of course, not the exact location. We don't want to help out stalkers, but that should be more or less where you are, if I'm correct.
That's pretty
Um,
close. Yeah.
That's pretty close. And at my side, it's 1907, so it's 7 o'clock in the evening. And what time is it on your side?
It's 10:07 in the morning here.
10:07 in the morning. So that's how we roll. We do everything over the internet, and then it really feels like a completely different time zones away, very far away, but it really feels, I would say, very natural to have this conversation these days. So, Peter, we jumped right into that, but before we go into the questions, tell us a little bit more about who's Peter.
I'll give you the business side of it, and then we'll get into the personal side of it more later, huh?
That
So
might be fine, yes.
I'm the co-founder of a company called Humanizing Work with Richard Lawrence, who's also been on the show.
Mm,
And we founded Humanizing Work a few years back uh, to do a little bit broader help in the world than just Agile. We both came from an Agile background. I first started practicing Agile in 2005 when I was an employee at Adobe. And
mm,
I was the program manager for Adobe's audio products. Uh, the most famous of those is Adobe Audition, which is a pretty well-known product in audio recording and editing, and
mm,
a lot of podcasts, in fact, edited in Adobe Audition. And our team had just completed a big 2-year release. This was using fairly traditional software product development approaches back then. Although our
mm,
team was pretty iterative and pretty cross-functional, so we had that going for us. But I remember being promoted to program manager on that team, and the very first thing that showed up on my calendar was a monthly lunch and learn series where Adobe would bring in an external speaker, and then the speaker would, we'd grab our lunch and we'd go into a conference room and we'd listen to the talk while the speaker talked. And the first speaker that showed up on my calendar was Jeff Sutherland, who created the
mm,
Scrum framework. And coming off this big 2-year release, we had all of the problems that every team has on a big 2-year release cycle, right? A lot of challenges getting the thing out the door and things coming in late and trying to fix a bunch of bugs before we got it out. And so when I walked into that conference room that day and was eating my lunch, as Jeff described different parts of Scrum, I kept having this experience where he would describe, say, a daily Scrum, And I remember thinking, oh, if we had been having daily communication on our team, then this one piece of technology that was foundational to that last release wouldn't have kept languishing and not getting done and not
Mm.
getting done. We would have helped each other get unstuck, and that would have prevented a lot of the challenges we had. And if we had prioritized differently and worked in iterations, this would have been better. And over for that full hour, I kept having this experience. And so, as you can imagine, by the end of that 1 hour talk, I was pretty excited to try this out on our team.
Mm.
And so, kind of the long story short of that is that we did end up adopting Scrum on our next release and used it and got a lot of internal benefits on the team. The way that we worked was significantly better with all of the challenges of adopting a new method, right? Maybe we get into
Mm.
some of those stories at some point, but uh, we really had a good experience with it. And as we got to the end of that release, Adobe was still using large release cycles. This was in the days of the Creative Suite, where a new version of the Creative Suite would come out every 18 to 24 months. And so we were using Scrum kind of within this broader traditional plan driven approach.
Mm.
And in that plan driven approach, Adobe had, about 18 months of feature development and 6 months of no more feature development, because now we need to fix all the bugs and work on integration. And in those days, we needed to burn things on DVDs to make sure that the installer worked and get marketing spun up. And there
Yeah.
was kind of a 6 month window at the end where we stopped building new things and we just start getting it ready to get out the door. Well, we got to that 6 month date and we didn't know what we were going to do for the next 6 months because we were ready. We had been,
All right.
keeping our quality high. We were releasable at the end of every sprint, and we had been working on integration for many months, and all of that was kind of ready to go. And so we had to lobby the company essentially to say, well, what should we do? Should we just stop? Should and we got permission from the company to go 3 more months of feature development.
Mm.
And then they said, and then at the last 3 months, we really need to have things locked down for marketing reasons and packaging and that kind of thing. And even that 3 months, it was pretty sustainable. We were just working at a normal pace, and but other teams that were part of that release were not working at a sustainable pace at that time.
Mm.
And I remember that there was another team in the same building. This time I was living in Seattle. Adobe had a very beautiful office in the Fremont neighborhood in Seattle. It was right on the shipping canal, where big boats would come through and the drawbridge would come up. And it was kind of a U-shaped building. And in the middle of that U is a beautiful grass field with trees and gardens. And it was a great place to go out and kind of take in the air and the sunshine when the sun was actually shining in Seattle. And when we got to this kind of 3 month window where we were just doing kind of sustainable development, and other teams were really in that very difficult time of trying to get the product out the door. I remember another big team that was part of the Creative Suite was uh, working mandatory Saturdays and very long hours. And our team on a Friday decided to get lunch and go down into the grass field and play a little game called wiffle ball. It's kind of like a kid's version of baseball, but the ball is kind of full of holes and lightweight, and you can't really hit it that hard, but it's a fun game to play. So we were down there playing wiffle ball, and I remember looking up to the second floor where this other team's offices were. And I remember the program manager, Ian, and the engineering manager were looking out the window and saying, how is the audition team playing wiffle ball when we're working 60, 70-hour weeks just to get our product
Mm.
out the door? So we ended up releasing, and then that team came to me and said, okay, tell me about this Scrum thing. That seemed to work pretty well for you. We like this idea of not having to work crazy hours to get this product out the door. And that was the first domino in many product teams at Adobe adopting Scrum initially, and then a lot more agile practices beyond that. And so in the next release, I spent a lot of my time helping other teams adopt Scrum and adopt agile practices. And over the course of a few years, I kind of had two jobs. I was still a program manager. At that point, I had moved to being the program manager for the overall Creative Suite. And then the other job was helping other teams adopt an agile approach.
But you did it based on the
And
experience inside the company. So you basically could say, well, it actually
that's
works
right.
at Adobe because I've done it and people saw the advantages it gave to the team. So it was in that sense probably well, easy is maybe too exaggerated, but it was yeah, it helped to convince other people because it was not just an external person trying to convince them. Am
Yeah,
I
in
correct?
fact, when other teams wanted to adopt or were interested in it, like that team, they said, "Well, tell us more about this." I had no experience doing training or teaching somebody else these things. I had been a teacher in a previous life, but I didn't know how to teach Scrum. I didn't know how to teach Agile, and so I would bring in initially. We would have Ken Schwaber come in. Ken is who I got my CSM from back in 2005 when our team wanted to adopt it. I wanted to get some training to feel like I at least had an idea of what we were up to.
Mm.
And so I would bring Ken back in. And the very first time that Ken came in to teach, he spent his first day doing his normal first day of a CSM. And at the end of the day, he said, "Peter, I think we're going to pivot tomorrow because I'm getting a lot of skepticism that this can work here. So tomorrow morning, why don't you take an hour and explain how you did it on the audition team? And I think
Mm.
that'll be much more convincing than me explaining how theoretically this could work." And so I kind of threw together a few slides about what we had done.
Mhm.
And that 1 hour turned into most of the day where people just asked
Wow.
me questions. Well, how did you deal with this? And how did you deal with that? And we did that. Ken and I did that 2 or 3 times over the course of maybe 6 months with different teams that were interested. And by the third time, uh, I was kind of co-teaching the class with Ken because of that point that you made, that
Mm.
it's
Yeah.
interesting theoretically, but how does it work here
Mm.
was really important.
Yeah, and I
So
think that helps a lot in convincing people that
right, right. So that was kind of my dual job for a couple of years. The last time that Ken came in, actually, I got my boss and his boss to come to the training because I was
mm,
starting to see how this would be really effective at a product team level. But then you start to hit all of the rest of the system that wasn't built to think this way, to manage work this way. So I
mm,
wanted them to come in so that they could get a sense of how this is supposed to work and we could have those discussions. And I remember towards the end of that class, maybe after it, uh, Ken, me, Jim, and Barry, my boss and his boss, were just chatting and talking about it, and they were really excited about the possibilities for Adobe. And I kind of made this little joke, and I said, "Yeah, Ken, it's too bad this isn't my day job." And Ken looked at
mm.
me, and he looked at Jim, and he looked at Barry, and he said, "Well, maybe it should be." And that planted a little seed. I hadn't considered doing this full time, but we finished that release, and I was talking to Barry, who was a vice president of program management at that time, and he said, "So, do you want to do this group program management job again for the Creative Suite for the next release?" And I said, "Well, you remember that conversation we had with Ken? I do think there's enough demand that maybe I could do this full time." And to his credit, Barry decided to create a new role called the Agile Transformation Leader. And in 2008, I switched from kind of that dual job of program management and a little bit of training on the side to really doing that full time. And I ended up doing that for another 7 years at Adobe. And during that 7 years, it went really from still a lot of training of product teams and beyond product teams. I started having other parts of the organization that were really interested in this. And uh, but over that 7 years, my view of what was needed shifted from we need this at the team level, which was true, I think, to we need this organization wide. We need to figure out what does this mean in how we structure teams and how we think about planning and how we behave, how leaders behave, how teams communicate with each other and with leadership. And that started really what I think of as the second wave of my education in what Agile is. The first wave really like how do you get this to work on a team, and then the second wave of well, okay, we can do it at the team level, but teams are part of a
Mm.
broader system. How do we change the whole system to a get good business outcomes, but also the part of Agile that I just loved was how it made work more meaningful and less the only word I could think of is less stupid. Like we're not wasting time doing things that don't matter, and we're not dealing with a lot of
Yeah.
bureaucracy, and it just felt like a better place to work. And so I was really interested in blending those. How do
Humanizing
we get
work.
the good outcomes? And hence the name of the company, right? How do we humanize work?
I really like that full story. Richard already told me a little bit about it, about how he saw his vision, but I really like how you bring it. And I'm also not really surprised in the fact that you first learn it at team level and where you see the advantages smaller, and then you let it grow a little bit. And I see so many companies that they see advantages and then they want to start it all over the place without having people understanding it at team level. And I think that's really probably more organically grown, but it was in the end probably a very smart way on having it succeed, because yeah, you have that understanding, you bring with the experience from inside, and you let it gradually grow to the people who are interested. And that's the advantage of a large company, of course, that there's always one more team that is interested and looks. If a team is not interested, okay, you focus on the ones that are interested, and you again let it organically grow. So thank you for sharing that story. So let's jump into that very first question. What is something that people usually don't know about you, but has influenced you in who you are?
Some people know this about me, but I think probably in the broader Agile community, it's less well known, which is that I didn't start in IT. I didn't start in computer science. My degree is actually in music composition.
Wow.
And my first career was as a composer, arranger, trumpet player, and recording engineer. So
And
in
is
the
that
US,
how
this,
you
yeah,
come also into Adobe and from that
yeah,
musical part? Oh, that's interesting. That's
yeah, I'll
interesting.
connect those dots for you. So uh, in the US, in order to be a musician full time, you either have to be the lucky 0.01% that has both the talent, the dedication, and the lucky breaks and connections to really do it. Like, I can make a living doing this, just doing whatever it is that I'm great at as an instrumentalist, as a composer. There's a lot of lucky breaks and a lot of hard work. Well, I wasn't in the 0.01%. I was probably in the 1% where I could do it full
Mm.
time, but it really meant that I was doing a lot of things to try and just earn a living. So I was
Mm.
teaching at community colleges. I had a recording studio. I would take any kind of job I could take. I was teaching a lot of private students, and really kind of just barely making ends meet, right? Like
Mhm.
many musicians in the world, I'm
I
sure.
was about to say yes. I can imagine many, 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 many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, our family was growing. My wife and I had, during this time, had our first two children, and we were pregnant with our third. And I remember at the time that this was in the earliest days of health insurance in the US, when if you weren't part of a big company, then you just paid out of pocket, and it was fairly expensive. And we got our quote for what our health insurance was going to go up to once Emma, our third child, was born. And the health insurance bill was going to be more than we were paying for our mortgage. That was the
Wow.
price of health insurance. And I thought, well, I guess I'd better go find a day job that has health benefits, because I can't keep affording this. So I was teaching at a community college. I was teaching music and teaching. I think this college that I was teaching sound design for film, which is a really fun area. Like, how do you create the soundtrack, including the music and sound effects? And I was walking down the hallway, and I saw on a cork board there was a flyer posted that a little company called Centrillium Software, that made an audio product called Cool Edit Pro. Centrillium Software was hiring testers, but they wanted testers that had a domain expertise in how
Mm.
actual users, customers of the product, use the software. And I thought, oh, I know Cool Edit Pro. It was one of the first audio apps I had learned, and maybe this would be a fun job. So I applied for that job. And there's a funny story about how I got to the top of the resume list when I applied, which is that my name, Peter Green, I share with a pretty famous musician, the guitarist and
Okay,
songwriter
for
Peter
REM.
Green. Yeah, well,
Or
and Fleetwood Mac, Fleetwood Mac, and in the '60s, great guitarist, great songwriter. And the person that was hiring me didn't know much about Western music. He had grown up in Iran, moved to the States as a teenager, and didn't know a lot of the kind of shared Western music culture that we did. And so this Nariman Sodefi was the hiring manager. Nariman, great guy. Just played poker with Nariman a few months ago. And anyway, Nariman saw the resume and he just Googled Peter Green musician. And he sees this impressive resume of, top 10 hits. He said, wow, this guy wants to work for Cool Edit. Great. Put his resume to the top. And then, of course, as he dug into it a little bit, he realized, oh, that's not the same person. But I had already gotten his attention. So I ended up being hired as a tester for Cool Edit and worked for that company for a couple of years. And then Adobe ended up acquiring, Cool Edit, and that Cool Edit became Adobe Audition. So that's how those dots connect. But the question is
And so
really how has
you
this
talked also,
influenced me,
wait,
right?
I want to
Yeah.
go a little bit back because you said before
Mhm.
also that there's just a few people that needed the luck. Well, in that sense, you also had the luck because there was a famous
100%.
person there, and it could have backfired as well once they
Yeah.
realized that you were not the famous one. Like, oh, okay, let's not do that. But that didn't happen. So I wanted to stress that out because sometimes
Well,
this is the luck that we have, huh?
think of all the different little points of luck that I happened to walk down that hallway, that somebody at the company happened to put a flyer up in the music building at Scottsdale Community College, that at that time I happened to be like, all of these things were little bits of luck that led me to where I am. And I think another kind of human lesson from this is that every time somebody's asked me, hey, what's your 5-year career goal or something like that, I just kind of laugh, because if I look back at any point in time, 5 years ago today, 2018, would I have been able to project that I would have co-founded Humanizing Work with Richard, that we are doing the work that we're doing now? No way I could have predicted that. And so it's really unpredictable. And I do think that there's a lesson there that if we just create a plan and then try to stick to it, that almost never works out as well as keeping our options open and and taking advantage of something when you notice some interest, like, that might be interesting. Follow through on that intuition that might be interesting. Because my goal at the time was get some health insurance, put some money in the bank, enough money in the bank that I can go back to doing music full time.
Because that
And
was still the plan at that moment.
that was still the plan. Yeah. And
you had to have a full-time job, and then you could on the side or whatever, you could still work on music because that was really your passion.
That was it. And for many, many years, I still had that, well, maybe in another year or two, until, I don't know, it was probably in the last 10 years, I realized I really love the work I do. Why would I change? And throughout that time, I've still continued to play. I am lucky enough to be able to play in a lot of fun bands and to get a lot of opportunities to do music. But I don't have this desire, this need now to make that my full-time job.
And I think this is also an interesting conversation also to hear. Sometimes we have these, I don't know, one-off hit people that write a good song, and then people wonder why did they leave the industry, and your story kind of fits into that. For whatever reason, they might roll into something else that they find interesting, and they move on with their life. And we think about them, about that song or that movie or whatever they did, and yeah, we think that this is the only personality they have and their only interests. And like you say, things move on, and your life moves on for whatever reason. It's really interesting to hear that. Okay, I interrupted you when you wanted to move to that second part of that question. I'm not sure if you answered it by now.
Yeah.
But...
Well, I think, the other part of that question is, how does it influence, I don't remember the exact framing of it, but how does it influence how I think and how I work now? Well, there were kind of two parts of my music experience at that time. Composition is about capturing in detail instructions for musicians to perform, for the performers to perform. And great composers learn how to communicate just through the written page. Here is the feeling I want here. Here's how you should phrase this part. Here's the tempo I want it at. And there's a lot of detailed specification in that. Now, of course, you put those detailed specifications in front of 3 different groups, they're going to perform it according to their personality. And so there's that part of it that's very trying to predict and in some ways control for the best possible outcome. And then the other part of my job as a musician was that I was playing in bands that did a lot of improvising, jazz groups, salsa bands where there was a lot of improvised solos, purely experimental music where we would go in with very little framework and just improvise together. And when the question came up of like, what's something people might not know about you that really influences how you think about the world, I see both of these as being in healthy tension in music, where, how do you get enough detail to a group, to an individual, that they have a sense of, hey, what are we going to do together here? And then how do you leave space for spontaneous, really cool things to happen in the performance of the music? And so just a lot of what I use in my my day job now, right? In my actual career is highly influenced by what I learned as a musician, both as a composer, as a performer trying to interpret other people's written music, and then as an improviser trying to collaborate with a small group of other musicians to make something great in the moment, sometimes with very lightweight and tacit agreements on what we're going to do next. So that's really influenced that. We actually did an episode of our show, the Humanizing Work show, where I got together a small jazz group, just some friends here in the Phoenix area. I didn't tell them really what we were going to do. I just said, we're going to record this show, we're going to videotape it, and I'm going to try and connect the dots between jazz music and teams. And we kind of drew some lessons out of how does a improvising jazz group collaborate effectively, and what can business teams and really any team learn from that. It was a really fun experience. So maybe we can drop a link to that show and in the show
I will
notes after the fact.
definitely. I wrote it down already that I definitely want to add that link to that. I was thinking also while you were explaining is that in IT, one of the things I see is that the larger the group of people that need to collaborate, the more kind of documentation we need. Do you see similar things in music? Is that easier with just 3 people without sheet, but once you have a whole orchestra, you need sheets, or how does that work?
Yeah, I've thought about the same thing as I've thought about the movement to scaling and those kind of things. Like if you just look at the results, you don't see ensembles of 100 musicians very often that are purely improvising, and you rarely see. Well, that's not true. I was going to say that you rarely see very small groups that are just reading music, but there's actually a large tradition of chamber music, string quartets, those kind of things that do that. And so small groups can do either, but I've never seen a very large group fully improvise. And if that's the case, it's a very rare thing. It's very difficult to do. And so I
And I
think that
would
there is a
assume
lesson there.
And I would assume that the large chamber orchestras that are working from sheet music, that they would have it easier to start improvising a little bit or trying out something, even if it's just in the practice setting, whatever. They could have a small discussion. Yeah, I assume that's almost impossible with a 100-person orchestra. Well, maybe the conductor can improvise a little bit and say a little bit, but you won't have that discussion with 200 people or whoever are in the orchestra. I assume
Yeah.
that's interesting.
So we could look at kind of 3 group sizes. Most improvising jazz groups are at the largest 5 or 6 people. Well, that reminds us of a lot of the research on teams, right?
All right.
Within 5 or 6 people, you can improvise. You can have a very either no agreement going into it. The greatest jazz improvisers can just say, "We're just going to sit down and listen to each other," and somebody will play something, and somebody else will respond. Most jazz groups improvise around a framework. They'll say, "We're going to improvise around this song," and there are common patterns for how to improvise, and to know whose turn is it to step forward and whose turn is it to step back in a supporting role. There's a lot of culture in the jazz community built up over 100 years now of how that works well. And then if you look at the next size up of a
A
jazz
little
group,
bit like we have frameworks in the agile community,
yeah,
right? They
100%.
are exactly.
Yeah,
That's
you can. I've often thought of Scrum as like a lead sheet. And here's the lead sheet, and then we're going to improvise around that lead sheet. But the lead sheet doesn't tell you everything to do. And if you just played what was on the lead sheet, that would be a very boring performance.
And after a couple of time, even working with the same, you would have already moved a little bit away from that Scrum sheet or whatever it is.
Yeah, you'll get bored as a musician playing exactly the same way every time. Yeah,
Developers never get bored. They
no, never, right? The
Okay, I
next size
interrupted
up.
you. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say that the next size up of a jazz group is like a big band, what they call a big band. And a big band is usually 15 to maybe 20 at the largest. And the way that big bands work is they blend both. There are written sections and there are improvised sections. And even within a big band, there are usually sections like the trumpet section, the trombone section, the saxes, the rhythm section. So there are 4 teams collaborating as a single group. And each section knows how to listen to each other. And then each section has a leader, the lead trumpet player, the lead alto, the lead trombonist, and they're listening within the section, and then those lead players are listening to each other. And so there is a scaling method in jazz where we have some structures in place, and we move pretty seamlessly between this part is written down, and we're going to play exactly what's written. We're going to interpret it just like a chamber orchestra would. We're going to interpret it the way that we want it to sound, but it is written down. And then we're going to transition into an improv place where there are now 4 or 5 musicians playing at once and the other folks are listening. And maybe a section will improvise a background figure that seems to propel that music forward. So that's kind of a hybrid version of it's written down like an orchestra would play to it's purely improvised. So I've thought a lot about this, that as we scale up teams that are really effective to collaborate, we need some kind of framework to do that effectively. And I think a lot of the more common frameworks out there for scaling treat scaling like a composer would treat an orchestra, where I'm going to write it all down and make sure that we've planned everything out. And the more effective methods are, how do we get really the teams, the sections collaborating really effectively, and then listening to each other and coordinating their efforts so that we build a bigger thing than we could build alone. So I think that there's something there, a lesson to learn from jazz.
That's interesting. That's really interesting to learn and yeah, to see it as a whole. I remember reading an interview, I think it was with Mick Jagger, that he also said, well, you look at the Rolling Stones and you see like just the 5 people, or depending on how many extra musicians, you just see, I don't know, 10, 15 people on the stage. But actually we're working with more than 100 people that are doing the light show and everything else. So for us, it's much more like an orchestra where we have to, yeah, we can't improvise that much. We have some structure about how we can improvise because we have that many people around us that, okay, they need to understand when we move in a certain direction. So just playing an old song that I haven't played in 20 years would be hard for the whole everybody that's around that. And of course, I assume that they have some agreement that they give themselves a little bit of leeway and possibilities. But it's a lot different than indeed 4 or 5 people just in a jazz club that just have to look at each other and don't have to worry about everything else. It's a totally different scale. So thank you for going into that detail. I really like that. I have a grandfather that was a conductor and played a lot of music. So I'm really interested in these kind of things, although I personally haven't really that much experience in music, much more than just having friends playing music. So really interesting to hear that. So let's move to that second question. That if you had not been doing what you've been doing now, is there anything else? So you were already a musician. Is there anything else that you were destined to become when you were young?
I think the other area that has reemerged in the last couple of years has been kind of in the visual arts. When I was
Mm.
a teenager, so my mother is a brilliant visual artist, illustrator, painter, uh, pencil sketches. That was her pursuit in college, was the fine arts. And as a teenager, I got really into, I don't know if, if you're familiar with this, but there was a PBS show called The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross, where in 30
Yes.
minutes he would paint a beautiful landscape. And it was such a
I think
famous
this
show because he's a
it's
beautiful
still on
person too.
YouTube these days. Eh?
Yeah.
I think you can find the show. Yeah, I
Yeah.
really like. Yeah, it's interesting.
So I
Go
got
ahead.
really into that in high school. And
Mhm.
I remember for my for my 16th birthday, I remember doing my best landscape yet. That's what I did on my birthday. That's my 16-year-old. Is I painted a Bob Ross style landscape out in the backyard. So I was really into that in high school. And then, I was so focused on music when I got into college and my early career that I just didn't do any of that. Well, then we were acquired by Adobe, and Adobe obviously is most known for the visual arts and doing that through computers. And I still didn't. I took maybe a class or two because Adobe employees get access to all kinds of training, and I took a
Mhm.
class or two in Photoshop, and but was still that wasn't my focus. Was doing that kind of work. But as our company wanted to do better videos and to communicate more effectively, I started doing more and more work in like Adobe Illustrator, where we're trying to create graphics, and Adobe After Effects, where we're doing motion graphics, and even in Premiere, creating visualizations of things, even things like marketing assets. And I've really, really enjoyed doing that and learning
Mm.
kind of a new tool set and a new way to express myself creatively. And that's been really fun. And so I could imagine that if the whole coaching, consulting, training world evaporated somehow, I could be pretty happy being a graphic artist or a video editor or an animator. I really enjoy doing that work. So maybe that's career number 4 or something for me. I don't know.
Well, like you say, you have no idea where you will be in five
Yeah.
years. So maybe there is something that is destined to do that. So that's interesting because it's indeed it shows you a little bit the links. Okay, there is that link with your mother. It also shows that in Adobe, yeah, of course, this is where the company is most known for. So that brings in a lot of other things. So that's thanks for sharing that. So let's move.
If I just
Yeah,
remembered something about that might be interesting.
okay,
Uh,
go ahead.
so I remember while I was still at Adobe, reading Frederic Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations, and being really
Mm,
impacted by the thinking behind that book. And I remember when I read the book, I thought, there's no way anybody at Adobe is going to ask me to give a training class in this Lalou model. But I
mm,
was a big believer that if you want to really understand something, you have to teach it. But those concepts,
mm.
I think, were too. It was a step beyond what anybody at Adobe wanted to learn about. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to just create a whiteboard animation of the Lalou model, and
Mm.
mostly just so I can really understand it myself. And
So
so
you
I
created it to teach it in a digital way so that you could understand better. Is that how I should
yeah,
look at
and
it?
I didn't really think that anybody would watch it.
Mm,
My goal wasn't let me put this out there and see who will watch it. My goal was I partly it was just a creative project. I wonder if I could do a whiteboard animation because I had seen like Dan Pink's Drive where they do the cool whiteboard animation,
mm,
and I thought that was a cool way to convey concepts, and I was interested in really understanding this book. And so there was an app. I don't even remember what it was called now, but there was a little app where you could upload a vector graphic, and then depending on how you created the graphic, it would do the the whiteboard animation version of that graphic. So I said, oh, that's cool. That would be a fun tool to use. So I created a bunch of graphics and created a visual for this and turned it into a video where I kind of did the talk over, explaining the model from reinventing organizations. And then I posted that on a Vimeo channel. And I tweeted, I think, to Lalu and said, hey, I put together this little animation of the ideas in the book. Just wanted to share that with you. Is it okay if I put this on my Adobe blog? Would that be all right? And he really liked it and retweeted it. And
Wow.
then another company said, oh, that's only on Vimeo. Do you have a YouTube channel? Could you put it on YouTube? And I said, I don't have a YouTube channel. And so they said, well, could we post it on our YouTube channel? And I said, sure. And so they posted it on their YouTube channel. And that video now has 300,000 views. And if you
Wow.
Google Lalu model, every image you'll see, the 80% of them are the end state of that video that I created. In fact, most people think that that's Lalu's illustration
Of course.
of the model. It's not. So it's another
It's
example of
interesting
just,
because I'm pretty
yeah,
sure that I've seen that video, or at
yeah,
least parts of that video. So it's
yeah.
interesting.
With the
Uh,
circles, the color
yeah.
circles, right? Yeah. Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
it's yeah. So I'll definitely try to find the link to either the Vimeo or the YouTube if I see it, if I find it back. But that's
It's out there. Yeah.
again, this is how small the world is, and how things were moving.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to that third question. That what you consider your biggest challenge, and why is it a good thing for you?
I think the biggest challenge, I'll talk about the biggest challenge. I'll talk about the big version and then I'll talk about the personal version, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's all right.
I firmly believe that if companies treated their people like human beings, the way that we treat family members and friends, like they're creative, they have their weaknesses, they have their strengths, but we can talk about those things. I firmly believe that if every company really treated people that way, every company that treated people that way would get better business outcomes.
That's a very lofty goal. Very.
Yeah. I just think
I
this,
like that.
yeah, I think it's just how humans are built. Humans are built to do things together. It's why our species moved to the top from an evolutionary standpoint, because we're better at collaborating than other species. We can communicate, we can collaborate, we can work towards shared goals. And it's fraught with all of the challenges because you do have the occasional sociopath, you do have bad behavior, right? It's not that those things don't exist, but I think if we were to build companies around a first principle that we can trust human beings to collaborate effectively towards a shared goal and to align our individual interests with outcomes that a company is trying to create, that we would just see a lot of the economic challenges go away, that we would see needed innovation in the world because we're, like all times in human history, facing the big problems that our generation and previous generations have created. We need new ways to think in order to solve those new problems. So I think it untaps creativity, it untaps business outcomes. And I think that, most adults spend, what do you think, 40, 50% of their waking hours working, right?
Yes, I used to joke that I talked with a colleague, yeah, much more than I talked with my partner at that time because I was
Right.
spending so much time talking to that one person.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, that's definitely something that I think many people would recognize.
And so the outcome there is that if we made work more meaningful, more not easy. I'm not saying we should make work easy, that we should all, automate everything away and we all just go in and no, hard work is meaningful and
Mm.
meaningful work is usually hard. So I think, we can work hard and do it in a meaningful way. But if we were to tap into how do we create work that's meaningful and engaging, now, right now, the most data shows us that about 30% of adults in the US and in Europe, and about 20% of adults worldwide are engaged at work. The other 80% are disengaged or actively disengaged. Actively disengaged means I'm trying to sabotage my company because I hate it so bad. The anti-work movement, if you think about anti-work, right? There's a big movement in the world to say work is inherently evil and we should do everything we can to bring it down, to sabotage these companies, to kind of to corrode it from the inside out. That's 20%, 18%.
Wow, that's a
Actively
number I
trying to
didn't
do
hear.
it. Yeah, yeah. And so that's trillions of dollars of just wasted effort, wasted opportunity is probably a better way to say it. Or if we could create meaning in our work, and maybe what if we could just shift the number from 30% are engaged to 70% are engaged and 30% are disengaged? What would that do to our economies? What would that do to our societies, to our communities? And what would that do individually when most of us go to work and we feel community and we feel meaning and we feel growth and we feel connection? I think that just makes our communities better. It makes individuals, families, friends, partnerships, it makes all of that healthier. And so I think the big challenge that I'm struggling with is how do we make that case to the companies that could do something about it and the companies that could do something about it in a way that other companies would pay attention? Because what do companies do? Big companies do. They look at the shining examples, the ones that are written about the press. So who are those companies today? OpenAI with ChatGPT, um, Google, Amazon. These are the big successful companies that get written about and studied and copied, right? And there are only a few examples of big companies that I see really going after this. Satya Nadella at Microsoft is an example of saying, what if we actually talk to each other like humans and look at the turnaround at what's happened at Microsoft over the last 5 years since Satya took over? Adobe, I think, is a good example of another company like this who just says, we're not going to lay people off. I know other companies are laying people off. We're not going to do it. We're going to keep treating our employees like people. We don't need to lay people off. We're going to treat them like people. And so there are a few examples of this. And so I'm optimistic. But there are also a lot of companies like that are doing really cool things in the world, like Tesla. But is Tesla treating their people well?
Not really.
Right. And so if I'm an entrepreneur right now and I say, who do I want to be like as an entrepreneur? If anybody's saying I want to be like Elon Musk, I say, oh no. Elon has done some really cool things in the world, but also created some pretty terrible outcomes in his companies and for the people that work for him. So, like all people, he's a mixed bag, just like all of us. But I would love to see more and more examples like Satya at Microsoft, like Shantanu at Adobe, of companies doing really good things from a business standpoint, but also treating their people well. So that's, I think, the big challenge that I'm facing is how do we make the case that if you treat people this way, you'll get better business outcomes and it'll be better in all those human ways.
That's a really strong message, and I think, well, part of the fact that you call yourself your company already humanize work, and what you the case that you just made and everything you said so far shows a lot that you really care about it, and how could we do all of that so that and like you said, it's also not an easy task to convince, because yeah, many people now look at what Elon Musk is doing at multiple companies and they think, oh, that's a good example. I'm like, yeah, depending on how you look at it. I think
Right.
yeah, there's a lot less. I'm a lot less positive about him now than, I don't know, 5 years ago. Even then,
Yeah.
back then, if you now look back, the signs were already there, but now it's becoming much more clear with whatever he's doing at Twitter. It's like, come on, you make decisions without knowing a lot. When you hear that at some of the companies that he has, people put kind of I don't know, shell or people around him to manage him so that the rest of the company can keep working. It's
Yeah.
like, That's it's understandable, and at the same time it's sad, because that's yeah, it should be, like you say, in a much different way. And I hear in that what you said here, and in a lot of that, oh, sorry, a lot of passion, a lot of drive. Do you know where that drive is coming from? Where is that something that you can link it back to something that
Mm.
happened before? That you know where you learned that drive?
It's a great question. I really do believe that part of who we are, we're just born that way. I really do believe that it's the old nature versus nurture question, right?
Mm,
But I do believe that there are core parts of our personality that we're just born with. I mentioned earlier that we had 3 kids. Well, we've got 5 now. And I can tell you that those kids, as pre-verbal infants, already have a personality that's unique to them. It's not
mm,
the parents, it's not the system around them. They were born with certain innate characteristics and strengths and weaknesses and focuses that have nothing to do with how what they're experiencing right then. And so I do think that there just is a part of me that has always been driven to be good at what I do, and uh, to be a bit of a peacemaker as well. I grew up
mm,
one of 6 kids, large family, um, and I can look back and say, so this is a little bit the nurture side of it. I can see early examples of trying to be a peacemaker. Other examples where I wasn't. Any of my siblings that are watching will call me out on that, like in any family. But always trying
right.
to keep the peace. And so again, I think that those are things that I was just born with. But then as I got into work, um, I I think that what drives me is um, this same idea that I was describing before, that there's no need to be mean. To
Mm,
put it in very simple terms that even a child would understand, right? There's no need to be mean. There's no need to be cruel. Um, we can actually have a healthy conversation, even if we disagree, and get a better outcome because we had the conversation. We don't need to bully each other. And I think when you look at those really core lessons that healthy kids learn about how to be a good friend, how to deal with differences of opinion, what do you do when you're frustrated? What do you do when you're mad? I think all of those lessons are the same lessons that we're trying to build into broader systems of work. And we have probably the same challenges that we discussed in music, where it's relatively straightforward to do that in a team of 5, 6, 7 people, harder to do that in a group of 50 people, really hard to do that in a 100,000 person, 500,000 person large corporation, because really there's no such thing as, I think, 100,000 person culture. What you have is an
mm.
average of thousands of 8-person cultures, maybe 20, 30-person cultures. So I think that's the thing that drives me, is like, are there ways that we could take the lessons we learn in our earliest school years about how to be a good person and apply those at the company level?
It's I really like how you link also the cultures at, yeah, at small levels and larger, and at the same time I link it back to what you just said, what happened the last 5 years at Microsoft, where there was a real culture shift,
Yeah.
where yeah, that is not just one thing that is very easy. It took a long time, but you saw that, the way that the new CEO took over the helmet and then talked with the people, really said like, okay, this is what I care about, and that was already very visible if you looked at the divisions that he led before. But that's, yeah, really what he said is, this is why the way I want to work with that. And I really like that you say, okay, that's what drive me. That was actually when I was born, already kind of in me one way or another. uh, I really liked also the fact that you said, okay, maybe as a sibling I was not always that person, because that's how siblings are. This is how children are. But I think it's, yeah, yeah, if you have children, you recognize already some of these things, and the older you get, you kind of look back at when they were younger, like, okay, that part was already there, that part was already there. And well, of course, as a parent, you always want to think that you stimulated some of these parts, but like you say, yeah, a lot of that happened without us.
Hmm.
We wish that, and sometimes we want to take credit, but I think that is really hard as a parent. And definitely, my children would say, "No, Dad, that's not you. That's us." That's
That's right.
definitely a part where there is. And well, that kind of brings me a little bit to that next question. That what do you consider your biggest achievement so far? Is there anything that you feel like you, because you talked already about what you did at Adobe, you talked about, okay, creating that new company, having 5 children on your own. Is there anything that you say that this is what I consider myself? Well, actually, maybe even before you answer that question, let's go to the question below there. Is that this is kind of a question to say, okay, let's brag a little bit. Is that easy for you, Peter, to brag, to really say I'm proud of this?
Um, I I firmly believe that instead of saying I'm proud of this, and this I think is just advice I would give anybody, instead of saying I'm proud of it, I like to say I'm grateful for it.
Mm.
D- And I'll tell you what the biggest achievement that I'm grateful for. Yesterday here in the United States, we celebrated Father's Day. So I've got 5 kids. 4 of those kids living at home or near. One kid who's married, who's off at college. And last night, my kids, who range from 23 down to 9 years old, we were all sitting around the table after dinner. We were playing games. Uh, they're kids, so they were poking at each other a little bit, but we just had a really enjoyable evening together. And the thing I'm most grateful for is that our family can hang out together and enjoy time together, and recognizing the very different personalities, the very different values that emerge as kids grow up, still really enjoy hanging out together across that very wide age span. And then later on that evening, my son Aaron, who is off at college and married, called and we had a FaceTime call. He called to wish me a happy Father's Day, but he talked to everybody because everybody was so
Mhm.
excited to see Aaron. And so everybody got a chance to talk to Aaron that was around. And that's the achievement I'm most grateful for, is that our family really loves each other and we support each other. And we can hang out and have fun and go through hard times and come out of that even stronger.
That is indeed something very to be grateful for. It's yeah, it touches me because it's indeed something that is not easy. Um, as a family, I think we all seen families where it's really hard to keep band together, to put it like that, and to have people really feeling like, especially at such a large age span, it's like, okay, they're in a completely different part of their life, so they're really looking at different parts. They have different kind of challenges, and if you can then still create that I would almost say community vibe, or that vibe that really is like, okay, this is us. That's really is a nice thing to be grateful for. So thanks for sharing that.
Mm.
That is something that yeah, I noticed that it touches me, and of course, in many ways, for many people, it's tempting to say, okay, this is my family, but the way you bring it, the way you put it, is really even much larger for me. That's so I'm really grateful that you wanted to share that.
Yeah.
So let's move to that next question. Do you have a personal agility tip to share? Anything that you say, okay, this is something that's, yeah, that I want to share about them.
Uh, 3.5 years ago, I decided I was going to run a marathon.
Wow.
Probably be helpful for listeners to know that prior to 3.5 years ago, I had done no running, maybe running to catch a door or running to catch a flight and being out of breath, for probably 20 years. In my
Okay.
early adulthood, I played a lot of basketball. I was never a distance runner.
And so
And I
what
was,
triggered you to then
yeah,
say, I want to run a
at
marathon?
this point, I was woefully out of shape. Okay. And my little brother, who was always the runner in our family, he lives in Kansas now. He's a psychologist there. And there's a marathon that runs right through our neighborhood every February. And up until my brother Mark said, "Hey, I'm going to come and run that marathon. Can I stay at your house?" My only awareness of that marathon was being a little bit annoyed that the roads were closed down on that Saturday morning. But my brother said, "I'm going to be in town. Can I stay at your house?" And of course, I was happy to see my brother and invited him to stay. And his old college buddy was going to run it with him. So we were going to put them up at our house. And I hung up the phone and I thought, wouldn't it be a fun prank to pull on my little brother? Because he knew how out of shape I was. If
Mhm.
when they got up that morning at 4 a.m. or whatever time they were going to get up to drive to the start line, what if I just came out dressed in like stereotypical 1970s runner attire with like the fuzzy headband and the old
I so see it.
Nike.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What if I just came out and I said, I decided I'm going to run this race with you. I'll drive down there with you just as a prank.
Mhm.
And then I thought, is it even possible? Can you go from being completely out of shape to running a marathon? And I think the marathon was maybe 4 or 5 months out. And so I Googled it and it looked like maybe it was possible if you work really hard. And so I downloaded a training plan and I started running. And the first run I did was, let's see, it would have been about maybe 1 kilometer.
Mm.
And I could barely do it. And I got back out of shape, just out of breath and feeling like there's no way. What am I getting myself into? But I really wanted to prank my brother. And so I stuck with that training plan. About a week into it, that short run started getting a little bit longer and it didn't
Mm.
hurt as bad. And I started to see a little progress. And to fast forward a bit, I ended up running the marathon. I ended up
Wow.
training more than my brother, who was the runner, and beating him at the marathon, finishing before he did. And I finished that marathon thinking, I feel better right now than I felt in 15 years. Thank you.
I really think that, yeah, yeah, it takes a little longer than I can't stop the noise. But I really like that story. If you can do that just in a couple of months, what do you say, 5 months,
Yeah,
from
5 months.
being completely out of shape to running better than your brother, who was the athlete in the family.
Yeah.
Let's call him like that. And how was his reaction? When you came out, did you tell him up front that you were
Oh,
practicing,
okay.
or did?
I realized 2 months into this that training for a marathon is hard and complex, and I don't know what I'm doing. And so I realized I should stop trying to pull this prank and get advice from my brother. So I did let him know that I've decided to run it, and got a lot of great tips on how to train more effectively. And the reason I beat him is that he also has a large family and he's a psychologist, and he just did not train as much as I. He didn't have the time to train. And I think he thought that because he had run several marathons in his life, he probably would be able to get away with not as much training. But
Mm.
he learned at our age we can't quite do that anymore. And so, yeah, I did let him know ahead of time. And it was really weird when I passed him. I passed him about, I'm doing the math in my head. I think it was about 7 miles in. In fact, pretty
Wow.
close to our neighborhood. And I passed him, and I kept expecting him to catch up to me. I thought, pretty soon Mark's going to pass me up. And he never happened. And I got to the finish line, and I thought, I must have missed him. Yeah, I must have gone in for
Mm.
a potty break, and he ran by me or something. But no, I got to the finish line, and our family was there, and they said, "No, Mark's a few miles back." I said, "Wow, how did that happen?" And he was very supportive. We were proud of each other. Right? It was. We've always been competitive growing up, but as we've gotten older, the competitiveness has died down and support has replaced it, which is a beautiful thing to see, right? But, I could have stopped there. I could have said, all right, met my goal. But I felt so good because what I discovered is that the habits that I needed to form in order to train to do that they were impacting all parts of my life. I was a happier person. Because I was healthier, I had more energy. There's this concept from, I think it's from Charles Duhigg's book, Habit, of a keystone habit, where if you set one habit, it makes other habits more likely. Like the famous example is if you just get up and make your bed, it tends to create other good habits around that. And exercise is an example of a keystone habit, because if you're running or doing any kind of exercise regularly, then your body craves, you need to be hydrated. So you start drinking more water. Your body craves nutrients. And so you start eating more healthy. You need the sleep and you sleep better. So your sleep patterns, like it just creates an ecosystem of health around it if you do that one step of I'm going to exercise regularly. So I just noticed just the overall habits, and psychologically it had a huge impact on me, because my whole life I had told myself this story: Mark's the runner, I'm not a runner. Mark's a runner, I'm not a runner. And even after running that marathon for months after that, I was still running. And if people would say, oh, you're a runner, I would say, no, I'm not really a runner, I'm a stubborn jogger. It's just kind of deflecting the identity of runner. And after I ran my second marathon, I realized, why do I keep saying I'm not a runner? What's that doing for me psychologically to say, that's not me, I'm not a runner? Well, I realized that if I said I'm a runner, then I have to keep doing it. And telling myself I'm not a runner gives me permission to give up if I feel like it, or to not keep the habit, or to own it. And I realized that's just a waste of energy to say I'm not a runner. And I think it was really just, I told that story for so many decades to myself. This is who I am. This is my identity. I'm not a runner. And that story was no longer serving me. And so psychologically, I realized I've been telling this story for 45 years. I wonder what other stories I'm telling myself about who I am, and in this case, who I'm not, that are just made up in my head. And so it made me start thinking,
So that's another keystone habit, in the sense that the habit of telling who you are, and by calling yourself now a runner, you start to think about, what else am I calling myself? And then you start behaving differently for other things. That's really a powerful message there.
Yeah.
So I really like your story at multiple levels, because it started as a joke, then you start to look into that, and you start creating habits of running. Like you say, the first kilometer is really hard, and you start doing it, but you realize at some point, oh, I need a coach. Basically, that's it. You realize that it's not just looking something up on the internet. Maybe if I really want to do it, I need some advice from people who've done it before. And so there's multiple, this story keeps on giving. I really love that.
Yeah. So I know that that's a different type of personal agility than you may have had in mind with that question, but isn't it true though, right? Like, yeah, this isn't a personal Kanban system. It's not how I manage my schedule. It's not how I stay in flow. But I think we can learn a lot from other fields, right?
Well,
like,
and this is
what do athletes do?
This is why on purpose I don't give too much context about this question, because every time I ask this question, and people sometimes ask me up front, yeah, could you give me a little bit more context? And I always try to stay away from it, because that's how I get to learn about other things. I love that book from the Power of Habits that you mentioned from Dukic. And I really, I see for me that there's a lot of talk in the agile community about, okay, agile is about mindset, but when I look at it, most of us that are really agilists, we learned a lot by habits. We learned a lot by doing it. Like you said earlier on, oh, every day that stand up, every release, every iteration. And this is a similar kind of story. Okay, I started running and do it much more, and gradually I improved, and all of a sudden I'm better than the runner, the so-called runner of the family. So it's I really like that kind of thing,
Yeah.
and probably the similar thing like you told yourself like I'm not a runner. Your brother told himself like I'm a runner and I don't need to practice anymore. And look where that got him. And it's
Yeah.
not to make a joke of him. It's like okay, when we tell ourselves, we need to really think about what does that mean and what do we need to do to keep up with it.
Yeah, to
Um,
Mark's credit, he takes it very lightly. He even jokes that for many years he was going to patent his training method, which he called the rest method. I just rest until
mm.
the race, and then I'm in good shape. And he said that worked well in my 20s. It's not working well for me anymore. I think we've debunked the rest method. So he jokes about it as much as I would.
It's also another important part of it, indeed. That yeah, there is we live when we get older, our bodies need different kind of thing, and probably when you're 20, you a lot of people would just keep running and would probably break their own body by not resting enough.
Mhm.
Where well, if we get older, we need to get more in shape and we need to make sure that we move a lot. Because I assume that well, if I look back at my 20s, I was moving so much. If it would go dancing or whatever we're doing that. I didn't have a step counter at that time, but I'm sure that I moved a lot more than I do these days when I'm sitting at the desk in the office. So yeah, rest was more important at that age. So that's
Yeah.
also at a different kind of level. So thanks for this. Is yeah, it's a very story that brings so many different kind of things. So that's very a wonderful story. I hope that it inspires lots of people that think, "Oh, I'm not a runner." Well, maybe you can be if you just have a marathon in your in your neighborhood and a brother that wants to jump in. Okay.
Well, and I'll emphasize again what you said. I don't think you change a mindset and then develop habits. I think you change a habit and that changes your mindset. So,
Yeah.
like you said, I really like the point you made. So, a lot of talk about, well, you just need to adopt an agile mindset. What does that even mean? People don't
Mm.
change their minds, but people can change their habits, and our
And
habits can change our minds.
well, your example of running was a nice example of that kind of thing. Okay, let's move to that next question about remote work. What have you learned? And I want to first, well, all of us we have done a lot of remote work since COVID. Did you do remote work before that at any place?
Occasionally, yes, occasionally. But most of the work that I've done in my career early on, right, in music, obviously, there's no such thing
Hmm.
largely. Uh, there were examples of, I guess that's not true in music. There were times when people would send me a song and say, please make up and record a trumpet part for this. And I would do my
Mm.
part and I would send it back to them. That became
Okay,
very common during COVID. It was the only way that recordings were being made during COVID.
exactly.
Um, but most of my work was in person. When I was telling you all the stories about the audition team, that team was in person. Now, there was an interesting story about remote work related to that, and that's that partway into our experience with audition, we ended up hiring. It was kind of a hire acquisition. It was a really great music software developer in Hamburg, Germany, who had just left another big company and was looking for his next role. And so we started up an office in Hamburg with 4 or 5 really good developers over there. And this was right before we adopted Scrum. I think bringing them on board was right around the same time that we had just finished this other release. They were going to come on board. We were going to start the next release, and we also learned about Scrum around that time. And so we experimented a little bit with cross geo. So it's not quite the same thing as full remote, but we started to get an early taste of this, which is we had 2 teams in Seattle, 1 team in Hamburg, Germany. How should we function as a team?
Mm.
And early on, we wanted to do like, let's make the Hamburg team feel like part of our team. And so the
Mm.
early team structure was we tried to do cross geography teams. A few people in Seattle, a few people in Hamburg. Now we'll really feel like it's not 2 separate teams. It's not the Hamburg team and the Seattle team. It's the audition team. That experiment lasted 1 sprint because there's
Mm.
just not enough overlap time to collaborate. You can't collaborate effectively that way if you only see each other an hour a day, right? And so then we decided to focus on co-locating product backlog items essentially around a team in a location, right? And so the Hamburg team is going to pull this product backlog item in. They're going to fully own it from really even refinement through eventually to done. And then the Seattle teams will own these other ones. And we would coordinate at the boundaries, right? We'd have sprint review together, if the initial part of sprint planning together, sprint review. We would do separate retros and then a group retro together. So we had some coordination points, but we realized pretty quickly that if we don't have overlapping time, then we can't collaborate. We like to distinguish two words that people use to mean the same thing, coordinate and collaborate, as meaning very different styles of work. Coordinate, if you break that word down, ordinate means put in order or plan. So coordinate really means let's plan it together, but then we can all go off our separate ways and just execute on the plan. And if the work is predictable, if it's ordered, or depending on what mental model you're using for this, if you're using like Cynefin terminology, if it's in the ordered domains, clear or complicated, then you really can break it down into the subcomponents. Cause and effects linear. We plan it out, we just execute, and everything will go to plan. So coordination works over there. It does not work if the work is complex. In other words, it's emergent. We learn it while we're doing it. We figure things out as we go. Then we need to co-labor. We need to work together on it. And that doesn't always mean the full team is swarming 8 hours a day, but it means the full team is available. We have working agreements on teams that, hey, as I start working on this piece over here, if anything changes or if I get stuck, you're available. We're available to each other to address emergence. And so we talk about collaboration as being a completely different style of work for that. And what we learned was that we really needed to co-locate the collaborators to be effective.
Yeah.
We couldn't have that span time zone. We could coordinate across time zones, but we couldn't collaborate across time zones very effectively.
Well, especially because you didn't have many hours that you could collaborate.
Right.
I think you can kind of do it if depending on how much time you have together. Of course, that's the kind of thing you need to.
That's right.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay,
so how likely is something to emerge outside of the overlapping hours? Right. That should tell us how to structure the team.
I really like that. That's a good idea to think already. Really hard about when you're working remote and what's the overlap and seeing that difference between collaborating and so that's already a really, really important thing. So thanks for sharing that part already. And you wanted to add something else, I think.
Well, then I just think as we all went remote, essentially, at least in our industry, as we all kind of went remote, we could still find ways to collaborate, assuming we could get enough overlapping hours, but we had to totally shift the tools that we're using for that. And one of the things I'm grateful about during the pandemic is that we were able to test and learn very rapidly because we had to. If we're going to collaborate effectively, what tools work? And how could we possibly do this thing that used to work so well in person? We just had so many experiments over and over and over again. We started to discover things that worked well. And I think we got so much better at remote collaboration during the pandemic than we were before, including acceptance that it can work. Right? Think about even agile training as a thing. There's just a firm belief that even I held and stated regularly that you just could never get this type of impact in a training class if we were not in person. Right.
But the tools have been changed also a lot since 2005. If you think about it, I mean, I worked on my first remote team in 2005 as well, and we had Skype, and you could kind of see each other, but not at the level that we see each other this day. And I think there's a lot that has changed also. I think that there is, it's again, it's about interaction. It's about the people. It's not too much about the tools, but the better the tools are, the better some of that collaboration is possible across the internet.
I think we had to kind of suspend disbelief for a while during the pandemic to say, well, maybe in person is still the best thing, but oh well. If we just pretended like it wasn't, even if I firmly believed that in person is the only really effective way to do this, it doesn't matter if I believe that or not, I can't. So we have a new constraint. Constraints are the mother of creativity. So let's get creative in how can we collaborate more effectively? So I think we got really good. I think as good as you could possibly be at that, given today's current technology, which will be different 2 and 5 years from now, right? And
Mm.
then the world opens back up a little bit again, and we start asking ourselves, well, should we go back to in person full time? Should we do some of this and some of that? And as we've done some in person training, some in person sessions, it was really interesting to go back, even as good as we got at doing it remote, and say, wow, there are just certain things about being in a room with other humans
Hmm.
that I didn't even realize I was missing until we got back in that room.
Mm. Okay, that's interesting.
And while the tools for doing this all remotely are still really good, I think there's just something about being in a room with other humans that doesn't happen on a Zoom session, that doesn't happen on any of the tools. And again, maybe that changes over the next few years. That would be amazing if we could have that same experience without having to fly somewhere or drive somewhere. Uh, but I didn't even realize how much I missed it until I did a couple of in-person sessions. And I'll tell you the place where I noticed it the most. Where I
Mm.
noticed it the most was in a team formation session. We were working with a
Mm.
executive team, and we were doing some team launch stuff for an executive team, and it was the first thing we had done in person since the pandemic. And so we said, all right, let's go to San Diego, let's do this thing. And Richard and I were co-facilitating this, and we kind of looked at each other and said, do we even remember how to do these activities in person? Luckily we're both very comfortable improvising, and we've done them before. So we got back together, and at the end of I think it was 2.5, maybe 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, we just said, wow, remember that conversation we had on the break with that one person? It just doesn't happen on a Zoom session. Remember
Mm.
how we just wandered around while pairs were doing this activity and we noticed something this pair was doing? So hard to do remotely. Uh, you notice the feeling in the room when we had that review and that person shared their appreciation for somebody pointing out something that they hadn't noticed before, and how that was really going to change their perspective on something. It just feels different in the room than it does on any remote session.
Mm.
And so the companies that are experimenting with some mix of the two, I think, are probably going to find that there are some times when it's worth it, given all the costs of going into an office and potentially traveling, that it's worth it to be together in the same room for a while, at least, until maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll all be wearing Apple Vision 13.0 in 10 years, and you and I'll have this conversation. I can high five you and you'll feel it, and who knows. But so far, it was really interesting to have that experience of figuring out how to do it all remotely and then going back. And that's when you notice the difference.
Well, and I think a little bit what you said is that what you see a lot of open source company or other kind of companies that are working remote a lot is that they have also been doing, well, let's meet each other at
Hmm.
least a few times a year, and let's have that. And I think this is where we can look at again at the balance, and definitely we need to see each other from time to time and look where we are. At the same time, I also think like what you said is that that feeling when you're remote that you don't always feel what's happening. If you are in breakout rooms, well, if you do a breakout room in a training, you just look at the different things and you know which sub team that you need to go talk to because you
Yeah.
just see it.
Hmm.
I think I was on this show that I also talked with Diana Larson that we said, okay, it would be really nice if somehow the breakout rooms could tell me somehow if there is a kind of, I don't know, if the sound is different or whatever. And I can, I don't know, maybe it's some AI tool or whatever can
Hmm.
help me a little bit to say, okay, this is the breakout room that you need to go talk to, just a little bit like, um, yeah, now these days the tools just don't allow me. I need to go in and then it already breaks whatever happens. Where if you do it in person, you just see it from a distance. This is the place where I need to go. This
Yeah.
this sub team is working really well, but that other, there's either they're not talking or they're shouting or whatever. You just
Hmm.
see that you need to go there. That's
Yeah.
and the tools are just not ready for that. And like you say, in person we don't need any tools. You're just there and you just sense it and you feel it. Like okay, this is working. So
Yeah.
thanks for adding that, because there will still need to learn a lot and need to digest a little bit on what was working better, what was not working, and like you say, some of these things we just need to adjust and learn from it. At the same time, I hope we don't throw away all the things that we learned about remote work, because I think we learned a ton of it as well, and we need to look at what are the different parts.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to move to that next question about a book. What's the book that you have read that you want to share about?
Yeah. And I always, if people ask me what my favorite book is, it's usually the last one I read. I have a strong recency bias with books because I get fired up about ideas.
Like
And
many of
then,
us have.
yeah. And I get fired up about connecting links between different books.
Mm.
I'm a big believer in range. In fact, this is another great book. If you've never read Daniel
Mm.
Epstein's book, Range.
I
Uh,
kind of look at it somewhere there. It's
yeah,
somewhere
yeah,
there. I
yeah.
love this book.
But I think we know that creativity and innovation happens by connecting to existing ideas.
Mm.
Like there's almost no innovation that's complete breakthrough. It's always there was this field of study over there, there's this field of study over here. Somehow somebody connected the dots, which means it's almost always a pair, right? If you look at
Mm.
Walter Isaacson's book, The Innovators, the history of computer science essentially and innovation and technology, he points out it's
Mm.
always a pair. There's no solo inventor in technology. It's always a pair because of that. But anyway, I digress a little bit because the most recent book that I read that's really got me fired up is called Senior Leadership Teams by J. Richard
I think
Hackman and Ruth Wegman.
that's the book. I
That's
think.
it.
Eh?
That's it. Yeah. And I've been familiar with Hackman's research on teams for many years. Hackman was a researcher at Harvard on teams in general. Probably the most recognized researcher on teams. He just studied them as like a science subject. What is a team?
Mm.
What do great teams do that less effective teams don't? Can we describe the conditions that are more likely to? So he has really good research on what makes a great team great. And Ruth Wegman was one of his grad assistants and then became essentially his research partner and co-author for many years until Hackman passed away. And she's sort of taken the ball forward since then. But the book Senior Leadership Teams is about what does a team look like for a CEO? This is really
Mm.
their fundamental question, because as they've studied teams and then went into companies to talk to the executives about what makes great teams, they've recognized that at the executive level, there are many things called the executive team or the senior leadership team, right? We have these names for these in companies. And they realized that very few of those things that were called teams are functioning like a team by any definition that
Mm.
they've studied. It's, the CEO with 7 assistants, or it's the CEO with 8 people that carry out their orders, or whatever it is, right? Not a
Mm.
team. And so that book is probably the most recent in their series of books about the conditions of a team. They talk about 6 conditions of a team, 3 that are essential, and then 3 that are enablers. And it's the best explanation I've ever seen for every great team that I've been on. Why was that team great? Because if you ask people to describe what about teams that they've been on that they really love being on, what was so great about that team, they don't describe the conditions of the team. They describe the outcome. Like, we had a high level of
Mm.
trust. We really knew each other on a personal level. They talk about the results of those conditions being in place, because we don't see what's swimming below the water. We just see the visible part of it. And they describe what needs to be in place in order to do that. I remember giving a talk once called "Focusing on Psychological Safety is the Wrong Thing to Focus on
Mhm.
for a Team,"
Mm.
which was an intentionally provocative title, because we know that psychological safety is hugely important for effective teams. But the point was, you can't. It's like going back to the jazz analogy. It's like listening to the Count Basie band, right? One of the greatest big bands of all time, and saying, "What do they do? What are they doing?" Well, they're really swinging. Okay, so if our band wants to to be good. We just need to really swing. Well, what does that even mean? Well, you have to have bandmates that have been together for many years. You have to be willing to rehearse together. You have to be able to work out conflict in a band. I'll give you the example of this related to swing. Where do we place the quarter note? Musicians will understand this, because if you just put a metronome up that's going, and if everybody played quarter notes on that beat, it would sound like boring. It would sound like a MIDI file. It would sound like, really boring music. Great musicians don't put the beat right on one. They play around with the rhythm around that. And so a band agrees, where do we place one compared to where the drummer is placing one? And you get a tension and a push and pull there, and it makes it sound great. But all those things have to be worked out. So this book describes that there are 3 essentials. The first one, what's the compelling purpose for the team? Why does this team exist? Now, for a product team, it's fairly straightforward. We exist to develop products and services or features for this type of customer. It's a clear, compelling purpose. This book says, what is the compelling purpose of a leadership team that is separate from the compelling purpose of the company? Why can't you just have a CEO making all the decisions? Do you need a team? And if so, what should that team do? What's the purpose of that team? I remember working with a senior leadership team kind of around this idea, and they decided that their compelling purpose was to create the culture that allowed their product teams to thrive and innovate. That's the purpose of our team, is to create a culture to allow the product teams to thrive and innovate. That's different from what that company made. That's not their product, right? That's not their service. It's not their mission statement. It's the purpose of this team. So we need a compelling purpose. If you have a compelling purpose, then you need the right people. Who are the people that are absolutely required in order for us to deliver on that compelling purpose? And Hackman and Wegman point out that it's not just technical skills. Like if you think about a product development team, it's not just the developer and the tester and the designer. Those are the technical skills required. But you also have to have people that have the teamwork skills to function as a team.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the exercises with I come up with that exercise where you build the tower with the spaghetti and everything.
The marshmallow challenge, yeah.
The marshmallow challenge, where one of the best teams were not the CEOs, but the CEOs combined with the assistants, because the assistants were really good at the collaboration and the community, the communication parts, which was really like, if you added these 2 kind of skills together, they were much better than just one group or the other. That kind of it's interesting that there is even theory about that. Well, I'm not surprised, of course, but that's
right.
It sounds like an interesting book to read.
And of course, kindergartners did the best at the marshmallow challenge, right? Because they have no ego going into it,
and they have no problem in repeating and retrying and whatever.
Right.
But that,
so that's the second. That's the second what they call essential. If you don't have a compelling purpose and you don't have the right people, you don't have a team. Whatever you call it, it's not a team. And then the third condition is it's a real team, and that's about being clear on who's on the team and who's not. If you ask anybody on the team, if you ask a stakeholder of that team, hey, who's on this team? Everybody gives you the same answer. For senior leadership teams, that's harder because it's not their only job. They're often, vice presidents or CFOs. They have other things to do. On product teams, we talk about how important it is to be fully dedicated to that product team so that you can focus and you can be available to collaborate, right? But on senior leadership teams, it's about negotiating. How available are we going to be? When are we going to overlap? How are we going to collaborate? So real team does not necessarily mean 100% dedicated, like we advocate so strongly in the agile space, right? But at the senior leadership team, it's about making a clear and honest commitment about how much of my team, how much of my time am I able to dedicate to the compelling purpose of this team that's separate from the rest of my job, right?
And on top, I would say, so for that, it kind of sounds like how many people do, when you ask them what's your number one team, would really say, okay, that's that CEO team is my number one team, because a lot of times
Right.
when you ask people what's my team, they would talk about the people below them and not about
Yep.
okay, that senior level team. That's a little bit how it sounds to me. That's
Yeah,
okay.
as we're working with executive teams, it always comes up, this question, this exact question. And
Mm.
the phrase I hear most often is first team, second team. What's my first team? Is it
Yeah,
the leadership team, or is it the team I lead? Right.
that's yeah. I've been asked this question also, for example, with product owners or with Scrum Master, whatever level you're working with is okay. What do you call your first team? And if you need to collaborate, well, that should be your first team if you need to collaborate one way or another. So that's an interesting concept that I think it's really important. Okay, when you sent me the name of the book, I was already intrigued, but now with all the explanation, it bumped again on my list even higher.
Ah, good.
It's so it's yeah, it's really like the kind of things that I want to do or that might be doing in the future is yeah, this is the kind of things that is really essential if you want to work with leadership at that level. They need to understand these kind of things. So that's the kind of books that really I find interesting. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, it's been probably the most exciting new kind of focus of our company is we realized
Mhm.
that we've been helping teams be great teams for many, many, many years. And then we've been treating executives like this separate thing. Oh, we're going to,
Exactly.
do leadership development and we're going to do whatever. And then we realized, oh, wait a minute. If you
Yeah.
want a great leader, put them on a great leadership team and help create a team. And it's been really, really fun to work at that kind of C-level team and help them create great teams and that have all of the same benefits that great agile teams have. But the impact, as we discussed earlier with the example of Satya at Microsoft, the impact is huge when those teams get it right.
Yeah, I was already kind of thinking about Sacha when you're talking about the book as well. I didn't want to move too much into that because it probably can take us another half an hour. But
Right.
it's but that's indeed the kind of thing I was thinking about at that level. That is indeed what was that purpose. What are the people that really are, and that's yeah, that's also what you always see when there is a new C-level, a CEO that really wants to think about who are the people and who are the people really that consider it. This is my first team. That is so important. And like you said, we've seen it with developers that if you're working on multiple teams, it's not working. And yeah, I can immediately see how that is impacting also at C-level, or at
Mm.
least at leadership, because it's not. I assume it's not just at C-level. That's the
Right.
highest level, but any kind of leadership, any kind of place in the company, I think that's the same kind of thing. So thanks.
That's right. Yeah.
That's really a powerful thing to think about. Okay, I want to move to, for me, one of the most interesting questions. It's that I really look forward is that what question do you think I should also ask you, and what's the answer there?
I think all of the answers that I thought about when you sent me this ahead of time, I think we've already talked about. So let me think about it for a minute. Hmm. Maybe it's all right. So what's it going to take? Here's the question.
Mm,
What's it going to take to create a tipping point in humanizing work? If we think
mm,
of humanizing work as just a broad description of many of the things we've talked about so far in this conversation, what would it take to create a tipping point, right? Because we're familiar with tipping points where there are a lot of kind of competing innovative ideas. And then if you get broad enough adoption, there's a point where it just
mhm.
becomes this is the new standard, right? And I think the way that I would answer that right now, you want me to just give you how I
Yeah,
answer that?
go ahead.
Yeah. I think it takes one of two things. It takes a massive crisis or a massive success. I think those are the two things that lead to tipping points. A
Mm,
massive crisis would be economy doesn't get better, uh, division increases in the world as it has been. Um, we see a regression away from a lot of the progress we've made in the last 50 years with expanding middle class, more rights for more people, more respect for more perspectives, viewpoints. We start to see a regression of that, and then a crisis happens that says we can't continue to operate as a human society on this planet where we're just concentrating wealth at the top. Think about what AI could do over the next 5 years. Like
Mm.
massive potential to change the workforce significantly. And if the profits from whatever happens at a societal level from artificial intelligence just get concentrated at the top of a few big companies, the way that it's looking right now, then what we'll see is even greater inequality and
Mm.
more unfairness and fewer people making decisions and having input in decisions. So that's, I think, the negative possible outcome is that we get to a tipping point, and it's a crisis tipping point. And there's a revolution, there's an overthrow that this way of life doesn't work anymore. People are going to rise up and say, no, we're not going to take it anymore, and we're going to
Mm.
change things. And that's almost always violent historically, right? So that's the pessimist in me sees that as a possibility that the only way to do it is through violence. And I hope and pray that that doesn't happen. I think the optimist in me is that if we if we think of at a micro level, the experience that our team had at Adobe, the experience that most successful adoptions of Agile that start to spread in companies are the same pattern. A team tries it here, it works well. Another team says, "Huh, that's cool. Let me try that here."
Mm.
I think the optimist in me is that this starts to happen at company levels, where a company tries out a more human-centric approach to work, works really well for them. And I think eventually, if you get enough examples of that, one of those companies will be the next Google, will be the next Amazon, will be the next Apple. And because they're so successful financially and from a business standpoint, now they're the ones that are being studied and copied. And we're not copying dictatorial, maniacal leadership styles like some of the founders we've talked about today.
Mhm.
But people going into business school or thinking about starting a business are saying, yeah, it could be like those old school founders, but modern founders function this way. They create this really human centric approach where people are collaborating and feeling connection and meaning. And you get enough examples of those, then I think you have another tipping point that's a positive tipping point where it's based on examples of doing it well that meets everybody's needs. It meets the needs of shareholders, right? But it also meets the needs of customers, and it meets the needs of employees of those companies. So I don't know which of those tipping points is more likely, but it seems like one of those is going to happen. The negative one has the other option that we just revert, that like all of the advances we made, it just reverts, right?
Mm.
That doesn't usually happen. Right? If we look historically, that doesn't usually happen. There's usually a new thing that emerges, but the the cost of that is so massive. I don't know if we can risk it. And so I spend my time trying to find and amplify the positive examples.
Yeah, it's well, I think that's a lot of what we're doing in the agile world is showing and looking and yeah, in a sense, when you're doing some kind of agile transformation, you want to show people that there is a better world, and sometimes it doesn't work at a certain company because they're not ready. And for a long time, I felt really bad about that. But the more I think about it, the more it's like, okay, maybe people run away because a certain company is not ready, but at least they move again somewhere else where because they've seen the better world, and gradually we improve the world one way or another. And it's yeah, it's in the end, I think a lot of us we're seeing a better world, but yeah, sometimes not always at humanized level, because like you say, sometimes they do it at team level, but the company hasn't figured out how to make it work at company level. um at the same time, I think it was Joshua Karofsky also said like, okay, we've been doing it for 20 years. That's a long time, but in the grand scale of looking in history, that's just 20 years. What is that? That's nothing. If you compare it to how long we've been doing whatever, building houses and building companies and whatever, it's just a very small thing. And it feels like it's a little bump and things got better, things got worse again at some kind of companies. Let's see. Indeed, in a way, let's talk again in 20 or 50 years and see where things have moved, if things have been moving, like you say, with a kind of crisis kind of thing. It's, yeah, I really like your answer because it's just not just looking at one way, but it's looking at multiple kind of options, which kind of goes back to what you said earlier on. Let's look at more options. Let's not just look at one possibility. So I really like that you do that even for such a large problem, I would say, or large question. So thank you very much for doing that.
And even if you think I helped a team have a good experience and it lasted 6 years or 6 months, and then the company disbanded that team and it went away. And it's easy to say, oh, that's disappointing because we want that to last forever. Nothing lasts forever, first of all. And
Mm,
maybe the effort that I spent to help that team have a good experience and find more meaning in their work and work more effectively for 6 months, maybe that 6 months is something they always look back on and it has a
mm.
positive impact on that life. And so, yeah, it would be great if every company across the world was thinking a different way. But, change happens one person at a time, one team at a time. And I think it's worth it, even if it all goes the bad way that I described.
Yeah, if
Then,
even if it's just for the 6 months that life was better for
yeah,
people, and for even if it's for just for 6 or 10 people for 6 months, it might have helped because it helped them, or at least to put a break into, or a kind of better way that helped them deal with the rest of their life at the longer moment,
yeah.
knowing that things get better. So that
Mhm.
is indeed important as well. So thanks for pointing that out, that part. Okay, I want to move to that very last question about who should I, and somehow it doesn't show. Yeah, who do you think I should ask next?
Um, if you haven't already had him on, I think you should ask Adam Weisbart.
I
Do you know
think
Adam?
I know. Oh, where is it? That's
There he
Adam,
is.
if I'm
That's
correct.
Adam.
And
Yep.
and I added immediately what he's probably most famous for, the video on YouTube about shit bad Scrum Masters say.
Yeah.
So Adam was.
Just hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah, which is he was already on my list, but like with many other people, I was waiting for someone to invite him. So
Yeah.
that's definitely it's always interesting to have it because I don't know him personally. I know him from his YouTube video, but also because of that for some other things that I saw him write and say. But I find it interesting to now have a talk because like you say, well, or like I feel it's like we know somebody just from that little video, and then yeah, it's a funny character, but I already have the sense that okay, he's making fun of it because he knows how things
Yeah.
get better, and that makes it really interesting, because sometimes it's a good way to make a joke out of what how things are bad, but you really need to understand. It's a little bit like when you talked about earlier about drawing. I don't know anything about drawing, but what I've learned is that you need to be really good at drawing in a certain way before you can do it in a different way to show like, okay, this is different. You need to understand it. And it feels a little bit like these videos is really the same thing. You can only make this at that level kind of funny if you really understand what's behind it and what makes it funny.
Yeah.
So that's why I look forward to that. Was there anything particular? Because I assume that you've worked with him. Is there anything particular why you think I should
Yeah.
invite
So
him?
I think I met Adam before I was even familiar with that video, and then I
Hmm.
connected the dots, and I was like, oh, and that's an example of something that somebody made years ago that happened to be the one thing that went a little bit viral, and so people know him for that. But I think how more people in the Agile community know Adam these days is through when the pandemic hit He said, well, I have no idea what we're going to do. All these conferences are going away. I have no idea if I can afford to even do this, but I'm going to create a virtual summit. And he threw together an agile virtual summit and just brought together a whole bunch of speakers
Mhm.
and made it free for anybody to watch live, and created this whole community around this agile virtual summit. And then over the years, he's figured out ways where it can still be free for anybody to watch live, but then he could create a bit of a business model around, like, if you want the replays, then you could subscribe or pay a little bit and you get the replays of it. And he's built out this whole new business model uh, that is really connecting people in a way that I hadn't seen before. And the reason I mention Adam is that he has the biggest heart. uh, he just deeply cares about people. He deeply cares about the same kind of things we've been talking about today. And he just brings a really unique and interesting voice to that, and set of skills to that I think are needed. So I think you have an interesting conversation with Adam.
Thanks for bringing it, and thanks for also pointing out, because the interesting part is I know basically both parts of Adam. I know the virtual summit because yeah,
Hmm.
like who in the agile world hasn't seen or hasn't felt it at that moment that it was created. But I didn't make the link when I was creating when I was looking for the video. I didn't make the link between this video, what he did there, and the YouTube video. It's interesting that again I look at multiple parts, and we sometimes look just at multiple things and not realizing that we know multiple assets of a person. So thanks for
Right. Hmm.
pointing that out. That's another part. Okay, Peter, thank you very much for your time. We're close to almost 2 hours of talking. If people want to connect with you, what is a good way to reach out to you?
Our humanizing work, humanizingwork.com is our website. You can connect with me on all the social media. My Twitter handle is Trumpetman,
Mm.
TPTMAN. Uh,
I
and our YouTube channel, you can search for the Humanizing Work Show, or wherever you find podcasts. We have a weekly show where we share a lot of these stories and just what we're up to.
I'll add the link to the show notes to the different kind of things that you talked about. I didn't prepare the Twitter link because, well, these days, like we just talked a little bit about what's happening with Musk. I'm not sure what will happen with Twitter. It kind of feels a strange place. I
Yeah.
noticed that I've moved to other kind of social media, but I still keep using Twitter. But it kind of feels strange these days.
Yeah. It
So
just feels
it's
a little dirty, doesn't it?
yeah, it's kind of thing like, but at the same time, I keep going back to it. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, the other places, it's like, yeah, there's a whole community that we build around in on Twitter, and that, yeah, kind of they're not all there anymore. But how do you find them back? It's kind of hard
Hmm.
these days.
Yeah.
Um, but this is also part why I created this kind of talks, because I really wanted to have a connection with more people from our community around the world, and find a little bit days to connect. So thanks for that time, because I really liked our conversation. It was really interesting. You really added a lot of different detail to many of these things. So thank you very much for that time.
It's been my pleasure, and thanks for doing this. What a cool what's the right word? It's a cool service that you offer to the community, and a really great platform to talk about important things. So I've really enjoyed watching some of the other videos, and recommend anybody else subscribe and like. Right?
Thank you very much. Yeah, but it's really like it's, well, I think any kind of these things, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. But for
Yeah.
me, it feels, yeah, it's like I said in the pre-talk, for me, it should really feel like a personal conversation in the top in the bar, but we record it and we share it with others, because it feels so much like we get to know a lot of different people. And yeah, and of course I do it partly for me because I want to connect with more people, and at the same time I think it's important to share, because somehow you talked a lot about the history of agile, and how you run into that, and we should also kind of record that, and make sure that people can find it back. How did we did it? Because if I talk to very young developers that have just been doing it, they don't understand what things were.
Mm.
For and it feels like some of it sometimes feels indeed very strange. Why are we working that way? but there is a reason that it was needed at some point. And like you said, we need to look a little bit on, okay, if we now work remote and we work again together, how does that work if we work face to face, and what are the, let's not forget about some of these advantages. So
Yeah.
and at the same time, I hope also with this video, I can show to people that it actually is possible to connect to people around the world. But if we want to do that, we need to take time. This is not a video that I could record in 15 minutes. I mean, it would not have been the same effect. I know it would be much more popular if I can create a video of 25 minutes, because that's a little bit how it works on YouTube, but that's not how you create these kind of connections, I feel. So it's not helping to get popular on YouTube, but I don't care. For me, it's really about a little bit what we talked about earlier before. It's about that human connection. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Yves.
Thank you for watching Who's Agile, where the stories of agilists come to life. I hope you liked today's interview. Subscribe if you're not subscribed and want to get to know other agilists.